Tom, if a student in 30 years was to ask you who Keir Starmer was, what do you say?
It's a very good question. I mean, in the cover story for last week's magazine, where I tried to get into this a bit, I was likening him to, prime ministers who we've forgotten over the years, that just kind of come and go. They're not giants like Margaret Thatcher or Clement Attlee or Winston Churchill. But, there are lots of other prime ministers who we just don't think about very often at all. Alec Douglas-Home is the one that I mentioned, who served as Prime Minister for less than a year. And there are lots of jokes that Alec Douglas-Home would tell about his time as Prime Minister, about how sort of, oh, was I Prime Minister? Oh, yes, I forgot, that kind of thing. And I wondered aloud, is that the kind of fate that we're going to that's in store for Keir Starmer, or even for Rishi Sunak, and certainly for Liz Truss? These prime ministers who just emerge and then go. And the fact that we've had so many of them, I think, is the interesting thing. So what are we going to think about Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak? In my first magazine as editor, I profiled Keir Starmer, as we've talked about on this podcast before. And I did raise this sort of question: is he going to be the first normal prime minister, the first kind of prime minister of a country that doesn't care about its grandeur, the first prime minister of a kind of mid-European state that is just comfortable being a mid-European state? Do we know who the prime minister of the Netherlands is, or Denmark, or Sweden? Most people don't. Is that the kind of future? Is he the kind of first in that line, or is he the last of the old kind of Blairite consensus, the last prime minister to try to keep it going, but who couldn't? And I think that is maybe still kind of where we're going to be thinking about Keir Starmer.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you talk about Truss and Sunak and him, I do actually think those are really relevant comparisons, because I do think about Starmer as a prime minister kind of without his own constituency, in the same way that with both of those, they obviously inherited majorities, but he won an election that, I think it's hard to argue otherwise. He was a beneficiary of the Conservative Party's collapse, right? And he did a very good job of marshalling an image of competence and, we will be able to get this country out of the mess that it's in, because we're serious, we think about things deeply, and we're also not sort of gallivanting around, having parties in COVID, doing insane things with the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They win the election. But as we have kind of come to realize, and I think some people did point out at the time, it was sort of a loveless landslide, right? He doesn't have, it's not a groundswell of positive support that's, yes, we want to put this man in Downing Street. It is, we're turning to the Labour Party now because the traditional party of government, the Conservative Party, has made such a mess of this. And I wonder whether this is a sort of constant trend, or if actually there's something kind of slightly unique about him in that sense, that he doesn't really have, I think he didn't really have a core vote for sort of personal investment in himself, and maybe we'll talk about this more as the podcast goes on. I think he sort of was missing a kind of emotional constituency, that it wasn't just, and this is where the contrast comes with Burnham, an idea of what he was governing for. And I don't know how tired this is, and maybe this is where there'd be a sense of disagreement in the podcast, but did he have a sort of a burning mission that he understood and knew, this is why I'm in power, this is why I want to wield power, this is what I want to do? And the extent to which he had that, or perhaps the people around him had it. And maybe we'll talk about Morgan McSweeney a little bit over the course of the pod as well, in that sense. I don't know what you make of that, whether he's almost fated from the outset because he didn't have that sort of core vote.
Yeah, he never had a core vote other than, I guess, the Labour Party's core vote, which was 33%.
Yeah, diminished.
Yeah. He didn't have a burning sense of what he was about, other than a sense that the Labour Party represented quiet decency, and its voters were the quiet, decent, patriotic, bedrock of modern Britain, and that essentially it was his job to stabilise things and to create the country in his image. And I still think listening to him, we're recording on Monday afternoon, having listened to him give his resignation speech. Again, he is parroting these lines that he really does believe in about England or Britain, and they're the kind of things that you could hear in John Major's speeches about England, or they kind of do have this long tail back into Orwell and all of this. What is England? It's this sense of a gentle, nice, patriotic, but gently patriotic, decent place where, we clean up after ourselves and we sweep the streets after the bad people have gone rioting. And that's the kind of country that he really does fundamentally believe it. And so often when you listen to Keir Starmer, you actually are hearing his life story and the family story. So you're hearing a sort of elevation of his mother, who was this quietly dignified woman who had health problems, who battled through them, who was supported by his father. They didn't have much money, but they were good people and they did good things. And you can sort of sense that in the way he talks about the country. It's a kind of idealized vision of the country. It's not really political. It's not fundamentally a political vision. It's in a sense, it's a small c conservative vision of what he believes in and what he wants to protect in the country. And you also get that sense when he speaks about the things he's most proud of. So the people that he's met who have suffered some kind of injustice, that he will then go and help quietly, almost like off camera, these individual moments, individual instances of injustice that he will have worked to correct. Now, again, it's not a sense that there is some structural reason why all of these injustices are happening that he is going to fix, on a macro level. It's like, I will fix this problem and this problem and this problem and this problem. And so I think you get this almost like this listicle of his achievements as Prime Minister. I did this, it got better, the statistics got better here and here and here and here, and therefore I'm a very good, manager and Prime Minister, without any overarching sense of, okay, what was the idea that connected all this?
Yeah, I think it also misses, politics has always been about narrative power, emotional storytelling, and I think to an even greater extent now in this new age of short form vertical video, of a million podcasts, media saturation, increasingly atomized society. I think those things that I would have always said were a part of politics are of increasing importance now, particularly if you want to communicate authentically and put forward a vision of yourself. And actually that sort of technocratic managerial tendency, I don't think it cut it then, and it certainly doesn't cut it now. I was struck, there's a couple of times, this speech, previous one, typically these politicians, they reel off their achievements, right? It's like, here we go, I'll take the flowers now, do the lap of honor. And I was struck that on both instances, I've heard him, in fact, more than that, I've talk a lot whenever he's usually asked to talk about his achievements. He will very often mention the transformation of the Labour Party under his leadership and then its resulting election and securing that largest majority since Blair in 1997. And I've been trying to sort of make sense and think about that, because I don't think I've really heard many prime ministers, when asked for their achievements in office, reference their election as being one of those achievements. Now, I don't know whether that's because actually the scale of the transformation he had to undertake in order to get the party into office is so significant that he wants to reference it. But I do also wonder if it is perhaps telling in a way that the machinery around him, we know Sue Gray, who was responsible for the planning of, the Labour administration, very quickly left once Labour won office, and that gives you an indication of how Starmer felt about the quality of the work that was being done there. But whether or not his leadership of the party was perhaps too focused on winning an election and not on the actual business of government.
Of course. I think that's absolutely right. But if you speak to people like Morgan McSweeney, and they'll put their hands up and acknowledge that they didn't do enough work into the purpose. But an election campaign should be about the purpose of what you're trying to achieve. That is the point of politics. There is a kind of conservative philosophy out there, a kind of deeply cynical arch conservative philosophy, which says that visions and plans and ideas are all for naive lefties, and that the purpose of government is to just manage the ship of state and just to keep it floating. All of this other stuff is just for for people who haven't grown up yet. And you really, it's just about protect what's good, stop what's bad as much as you can, and don't screw up.
What's the thing? It's like don't take the gate down. Ask why the gate is there.
Yeah. It's a sort of image that I've always been fascinated by. It's this sort of the story of the liberal and the conservative who are walking through the desert, and they come across a gate, and the liberal sort of says, what is this there for? What is it? What the hell's this? We've got to knock it down. It doesn't make any sense. And the conservative goes, whoa, you don't know. You don't know. Leave it until you figured it out. And that's a kind of old traditional divide. But I think in many ways that's disappeared in the it probably, at least since Thatcher, you've had a real, ideological conservatism, which, is very much animated by a sense of purpose and ideas and mission and all of those things. And I'd say that in some sense, this gets to the heart of the debate about, the modern left, Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, the critics of the Labour Party and Keir Starmer and all the rest from the left would very much, I think, subscribe to the notion that this isn't a party fundamentally of ideas and moral mission anymore. It's a party based on effectively conservatism, small c conservatism. It's protecting the status quo, the sort of the Blairite status quo, or some on the left would say the Thatcherite status quo. Effectively protecting the system that exists today. Equally, many on the right would say that is the argument today. That while they would say no, Keir Starmer is about protecting the Blairite status quo, not the Thatcherite one. Blair destroyed that status quo. There is that sense that on both sides of the political spectrum, the more kind of either whether you describe that as populist or radical or whatever, that they are looking in and they see, effectively a uniparty conservatism. And I think it is a challenge that the centre left and the centre right are increasingly struggling to deal with, right? That sense that, okay, what is the moral mission here? Where is the radicalism? Where is the constitutional radicalism or the, economic radicalism? It doesn't appear to be there. It's just about protecting the status quo in all of its forms, right? So it's like whether it's the Blairite constitutional order, the Thatcherite economic consensus, the foreign policy consensus that we've had, for beyond both of those. Where is the fundamental challenge to any of this?
I guess Andy Burnham, in a way, is making that critique as well, right? When he says that he wants to end 40 years of neoliberalism, implicit in that is that the last 2 years are part of those 40 years, right? That he doesn't view Starmer as much of a departure from that consensus. And I've always struggled with this because, I would probably categorize myself as one of those people on the left that would level those criticisms at Starmer. But if you ignore the rhetoric and discourse, one of the things I've always found fascinating about him, and particularly Reeves, is they would very often employ the rhetoric and vocabulary of fiscal conservatives. They would talk about the difficult choices that had to be made, invoke the household budget metaphor. And I always found it quite strange because Rachel Reeves was a chancellor who in consecutive budgets raised more than £25 billion in taxes and changed the fiscal rules in order to increase capital spending on infrastructure projects, which is not a world apart from the world that Andy Burnham is talking about, right? He's talking about house building, and yes, the Labour government has fallen really quite far short in terms of their own targets, which I would have viewed as not significant enough. Maybe he's going to place more of a focus on regional transport links. He also obviously wants to do a massive house building program, but they're not worlds apart. We're talking about a tax raising chancellor who taxed to spend, and yet it came with this rhetorical tendency to, I think, talk more right, as in right wing, than they were actually governing.
Yeah, I think part of that is the ability to obviously communicate the purpose of your government, to communicate the story, as you know, a lot of people will say, or the narrative, all of that. You know, that is clearly a part of what, you know, what a politician has to do. He or she has to be able to say, you know, here's what I stand for, here's what I'm trying to achieve. You know, if you don't like it, at least you're judging it based on my definition, and there'll be supporters and there'll be opponents based on that. And he clearly he clearly struggled to do that. You know, and that is probably comes back to the opening question about why it's forgettable. You know, why are we likely to sort of memory hole this period? And I think there's sort of two things going on, in a sense. One is that inability to define it outside of technical or technocratic, metrics to measure against. And so both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak deployed the same strategy, right? They both said, right, here are the targets, you know, and I'm going to pursue them, and you measure, you know, my success based on these targets. Rishi Sunak, I think, had 5. Keir Starmer had 5. Keir Starmer changed them once he got into government. He changed his missions to milestones. Nobody knows what those milestones are, other than the sort of the super geeks of Westminster politics, you know. But I'd challenge almost anyone to remember the 5 missions and the 6 milestones. And so some of the people that were involved in the missions, you know, have said to me, privately, this is like the sort of the original sin of the Starmer government, to give up on the missions, because the idea of them was that they weren't so technocratic. They were sort of, you know, they suggested something beyond that, something more strategic or ideological, or, you know, or moral even. So anyway, but you get the same sense with the two of them, that they were setting these, you know, these targets and measure me against those, and that's how their administrations would be remembered. But that's not how people think and behave. You kind of understand somehow that you're on their side or you're not on their side. You know, that you stand for a certain thing or you stand for something else. And so it's hard to sort of to think about Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in those ways. And then I think when you cast back, and this is what I was trying to think about in my piece last week, was, you know, we have had a period now going back to, say, David Cameron in say that from 2015 at least. We've had this kind of period of chaos where we've had all of these different types of government. And it's very hard to cohere them into anything approaching a kind of understandable, coherent story. So, you know, we have the coalition years, which, you know, how do we think about that now? Basically one of austerity and social liberalism, I guess, in one way. Then that merges into the 1 year of conservative majority rule under David Cameron, which turned out to be, you know, a total failure on its own terms. It collapses in on itself. So we don't really know how to judge that, other than essentially his fundamental misjudgment about the referendum. And then we have this 10-year period after the referendum, where we have Theresa May for 3 years. How do we understand her? Well, in many ways, she was defining herself against David Cameron from the moment that she delivered her speech outside Number 10. She used that pulpit to say, you know, I am going to change Britain so that it works for everybody. Implicit criticism that the last lot were only in it for the privileged few. She fails within a year because she loses her majority, and then we enter into chaos. Boris Johnson takes over, and again is defined in one way. You just talked about him being this government sort of almost governing more left wing than they actually their sort of public perception. Almost the inverse was true of Boris Johnson. But we don't, again, how do we think of Boris Johnson now? We think of him as Partygate and sort of just inadequacy. Then we have the chaos of Liz Truss, which is defined against other things. Is it a continuation of Boris? What is it? Fiscal incontinence. Then we have Sunak. So it's almost like it's impossible to think for any of us about this period of time in any coherent way, in the way that you would about Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher or Clement Attlee.
This might be a bit of a tangent, but I'd venture that I think COVID has a really significant role to play here. In that, I think, for large numbers of us, this extraordinary global event takes place in ways that really materially changes your life. And, that's not to say that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't have a material impact on your life. It clearly does. But when you're literally confined to your own four walls, like, do I have a garden? Can I go outside? Oh, I live in a flat on the 5th floor of a townhouse. I can only go outside for 1 hour a day for my state mandated walk. People's lives really changed, and very often not for the better. And then all of a sudden we come out the other side of it. It takes a while. Vaccines, something that we're talking about Boris Johnson. I mean, should really be applauded in the way that we drove that vaccination through. And I feel like that inculcated a kind of sense of a willingness to use the phrase memory hole, which I think is a really appropriate one, to just kind of compartmentalize it and go, right, that's over now. And as much as we could, and there's these bizarre we have these like little relics, sometimes when you go into a pub or a restaurant, they've still got the sticker, and it hasn't been taken down. And I sort of think, why is it still there? And in a way, it's kind of like it's like a memento. It's like a remembrance, this extraordinary event that happened to all of us. And we just have little sort of 2 meter keep your distance stickers in places. They're like the little artifacts that left behind. I'm reading M. John Harrison's, The End of Everything, and it's a really good sort of part sci-fi, supernatural, satirical. There's some sort of crisis has happened that no one quite understands why it's happened, and the phrase that comes up is Europe has been mislaid. Like no one remembers where Europe is or what's going on, and it reminds me of what you're talking about here, and the literary references in your piece. But also, I actually think that as a sort of body politic, as a society, we now have this tendency, rather than to go, well, why did that happen? What does it mean? What is happening to us? We prefer to just sort of go, oh, well, it's over, on to the next one. I'm sure Trump's going to bomb somewhere else next week. I'm sure we'll have another prime minister in 2 years' time. What is the point of caring about any and all of this? Because it is also transient. It is also passing. Does it mean anything to me? And this doesn't end in a question, Tom, so you're going to have to help me out here. But that's kind of the way I think about it, feel about it.
Yeah, that transient chaos, as you describe it, is, I think, part of the issue here, and it's part of why when Andy Burnham got into the steps of number 10 today, there are no steps, but when he got to Downing Street and he delivers his speech, he is saying he's trying to address this, but you're left with the same formula then that, in a sense, that Keir Starmer had, which is stability will be change.
Yes.
So, and that is, and for Andy Burnham, he's trying to get he doesn't want that to be the message, because it has to be beyond that. It has to be about this sort of 40 years of neoliberalism, or 40 years of where we took a wrong turn 40 years ago. And there is a coherent story there. I mean, 40 years is an interesting one. That's 1986. 86 is, 7 years into Thatcher's time in office. We can give him leeway. He means the 1980s, right? Like that's his reference point. That's where he says things went wrong. That the country was deindustrialized and life's essentials were privatized. The sense of decline.
Right to buy.
Right to buy. Now, that is a coherent story here. Now, it's an interesting one, and this is why I think he provoked quite a bit of reaction from Tony Blair, on that very question, because Tony Blair is saying kind of incredulously, hang on, so you're saying 40 years of neoliberalism, you're just lumping me in with this, and so Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and everything that came after is just all of a one piece, including Andy Burnham's time in government, in the Blair governments and the Brown governments. So he's reacting to that telling of a story, but it's there is something there that is a coherent argument, whether it's right or wrong. There is an argument there that you can make, and you can sort of, and certainly from the perspective of those largely outside of the southeast of England, there'll be a lot of people who effectively agree with that, and just say, yeah, most of this country has been in decline since then. The story that you tend to hear in the southeast, at least, and among the kind of Tory press, is that there is the story of Britain, and this is what I try and get into in the piece as well, is from 1945 to 79 is a decline. And then from 79 onwards is a kind of resurrection through Thatcher's grit and determination to reimpose the power of the state over, over all of these people challenging the sovereignty of Parliament and the democratic will. That's the kind of the story. And that is being challenged now more and more, actually. So not just by Andy Burnham. I think Andy Burnham, in a sense, is the inheritor of a retelling of this story. You can see it in, say, David Edgerton's book on the post-war Britain, which is makes this argument very explicitly. He's saying, no, if you look at most metrics of post-war Britain, there is no major uptick in the 1980s or in the Thatcher period. The living standards were improving at a greater speed before then than they did after then. Duncan Weldon's book, Muddling Through, on post-war, but I think it's beyond post-war economics, actually, makes a very similar point, that if you actually take in the round 1979 to 1990, or particularly if you take in the big recession that happens just after Thatcher leaves. So if you take the recession at the beginning, the recession at the end of that period, and you average it out and say, is this a great period of national renewal? Effectively they question that, right? And so I think this relitigating the history is quite an important moment here, in that if this is going to be the heart of Burnham's premiership, if he is going to make it the central part of it, as he told me when I profiled him in September, he said, part of it is about unwinding the 1980s. So it's a kind of, it is an explicit attack on that settlement. Now, that is something significant if it's actually true and how it's defined. It doesn't necessarily mean trying to recreate the 1970s. I think that's where people are kind of being willfully sort of simplistic if you just say, oh, that means he wants to bring back everything that's in the 1970s. No, just as Margaret Thatcher was sort of illuminated by the Grantham of her childhood in the 1930s, doesn't mean that she was actively seeking to reimpose 1930s Britain. But in that process of trying to unwind something that you disagree with or you think went wrong, you're going to create something new.
Well, yeah, I think that there's been a lot of sort of naivety, willful ignorance, misinterpretation about his remarks, particularly in that interview. The one I still, reading the weekend's papers, you still see the "in hoc to the bond markets" quote, like repeatedly referenced, and we've spoken about it before. I've spoken about it with other people on the pod about it's probably slightly misinterpreted, but we don't need to relitigate that now. I do, on this point about memory and what he will be remembered for, I think we should certainly at least give a bit of time for us to talk about Gaza, moral leadership, moral authority. But I do just want to take a step back, because I'm conscious, we've been very critical of his time as Prime Minister, and I think, you'd have to describe his time as Prime Minister as a failure. He's not even made it halfway through his parliamentary term. But we should consider some of the really significant achievements and positives that they've reached in leadership. Not least, we've had this idea bouncing around in our editorial meetings about sort of new parents and the policy measures that the government's adopted. That the reduced cost in childcare policy that the government's rolled out is genuinely transformative. As
a new dad speaks.
Yeah. Thank you, Keir. No, I know people. I know people who make a lot of money, and do not have the support. And when they tell me about their nursery bills, they are eye-wateringly expensive, right? I benefit from it. Other people have young families. It's genuinely transformational bit of policy. We were talking about that idea, right? Because it sort of, if you sit the social media ban in that context as well, it does sort of, you can start to sort of put a constituency together. Oh, maybe, okay, this is the government for sort of, the MSN generation of parents who are trying to raise this generation in a whole new world. For what it's worth, I think that social media ban and a few other things illustrative of a slightly authoritarian tendency in Starmer that I think will colour the imagination a little bit about him, and Gaza will too, and we'll talk about that next. But just to pause, Tom, and for you to reflect on, like, what did he achieve that was a success? What did this government do that you come away thinking, yeah, do you know what, actually, there has been some good as well as the bad?
It's a fair challenge. I would probably struggle more than you, and you're a more outspoken critic of Starmer himself or this government than me. But I would say, even on the childcare thing, in fact, it began under the previous government.
Yep.
I think some of the things that he talks about in his speech, immigration reductions, they are again largely the product of the previous government's decisions, many of which were taken entirely chaotically and are not necessarily to be cheered. I think there's every possibility that we come to consider the immigration restrictions as keeping out lots of people that we would quite like to come to this country. I was speaking to the chancellor of a university who was saying it's a total nightmare to try and just get people, not, because of the salary cap that was introduced, trying to get, people in who would be a massive benefit to this country and can't come in, while actually achieving, not very much on other parts of the migration issue, small boats and other things. So I'm not sure there are these major wins, to be honest. I think if you were to go back to it and you would try to think structurally, you'd probably come back to the point that you were making at the beginning, which is what they really did was come in and raise taxes on businesses more than people, but also on people. They came in and raised taxes and loosened the fiscal rules to try and change the way the economy functions, so it encouraged more investment, and that, I think, capital investment and other types of investment, that is you hear that privately when you speak to some of the sort of strategic thinkers in this government, saying that's at the core of what they're trying to do. That you have to raise taxes because of the burdens on the state that are structural, fundamental, not going away. They're about aging society. They're about costs of elderly care, costs of healthcare, all these things that are going to continue on. The war in Ukraine, all these fundamentals mean that taxes have to go up. Taxes have gone up as a result, and the economy has started to recover. And so maybe that is the something where you could say, that although it was shrouded in a kind of dishonesty about you box yourself in far too much, you've tried to pretend that you haven't raised taxes because that's what you promised at the last election, but fundamentally you did. So, so mild credit for that.
Very generous. Okay, let's talk about Gaza, and I do just want to caveat this for listeners as well, in that this isn't an opportunity. We're not going to discuss at length the ins and outs of the war. There are other podcasts where we've done that. There are very, very strong covers of this magazine. I think back, Tom, to the Jonathan Sumption essay that you published very early on in your time as editor, where the bigger issues have been discussed. And I say that because I just want to talk about this in the context of Keir Starmer. I don't want people to get the impression that I think that's the only reason why it's relevant.
Yeah.
But for me, I think his moral authority was really diminished by the conflict. Not least because he had made such a significant part of his pitch to the electorate to be that we are a party of moral upstanding. We are good people. We will make sensitive decisions, and we'll be guided by a sort of a sense of justice and injustice in everything that we do. And there is that moment very shortly. He's still the leader of the opposition. Shortly after October 7th, where he gives an interview on LBC to Nick Ferrari. And Nick Ferrari is asking him about the collective punishment of Gaza. And he says, do the Israelis have the right to cut off water and power from Gaza? Starmer replies, and he says, I think Israel does have that right. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I do think Israel has that right. Now, people just listening to that broadcast will think, oh my goodness, has the leader of the Labour Party and a former humanitarian lawyer just endorsed possibly the committing of war crimes? Starmer very quickly pushes back, gives another interview shortly after, says he misspoke, said that he was saying that Israel had a right to defend itself, not to do those things. Why am I talking about this? I think it's a really revealing moment, not least because what if a prime minister would sooner misspeak in that, like if we accept his explanation, if he would sooner misspeak in that way, understands with deep sensitivity international law, humanitarian law, would say that. What does it say? And I think he was acutely aware of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He was acutely aware of the way that he wanted to change the party, and I think he was worried about that criticism being levelled at him. And I think that's what led to that instance of him misspeaking. And if we are to pass the 2 years that happened since, the horror of that conflict, the tens of thousands of people killed, and again, they will respond and say, recognise the Palestinian state, limited arms shipments to Israel as well. I think that with hindsight, and particularly people on the left, I think that is probably the most significant thing that people will remember Keir Starmer for, and they will also say it diminished his moral and political authority.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will say that. I mean, and I think it's something that the Labour Party is obviously trying to deal with now, right? So they are trying to repair that damage. I think it's a question that we all have to grapple with. Is this conflict becoming, or has it already become long ago, the defining conflict of our time, the defining moral question of our age? And I think clearly for a lot of British Muslims, a lot of British people in general on the left, who just are horrified by what they're watching, that is the reality. That's how it has become, and they understandably then just make a decision. Well, if you do think a genocide has been committed or war crimes, then from that point a lot flows naturally, and it's therefore like unlike other conflicts in the Middle East or other other wars involving Israel and either Lebanon or the Palestinians or other things, even unlike the Iraq war or the war in Afghanistan. It's something beyond that because of the nature of what is being discussed, and so that is you're right to say that potentially is going to be something that defines him. In a way, actually, that is the case with Tony Blair in Iraq. It's not something that he can sort of get beyond. It's just, it is there. And in the same way that for a lot of people, it was a kind of line in the sand, and it changed politics as a result. And I think that does have the power. This war continues to have that power over British politics. And I guess it's like it's a lesson, in moral leadership, in also just in sort of history, that it's not possible in a way to going back to what we were talking about with Keir Starmer, that he's trying to sort of protect what he sees as a kind of reasonable center as he sees it. So he is trying to protect the relationship with the United States and Europe and Britain's allies and international law all at the same time, while trying to protect Britain's economic position in the world, its public services, blah, 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 everything all at once. But the world is shifting all the time, and politics is shifting all the time. And sometimes it's not possible just to maintain things in this way, that if you're on the kind of defensive, just trying to maintain the position that you have, that you end up losing as a result. I saw some message the other day about the football, and it says if your game plan is just to defend what you have, you'll usually lose. It's the same in tennis, it's the same in football, and Tony Blair actually himself used to say this about politics, in that if you start to go on the defensive to protect what you've got, so you don't try to misspeak, you don't try and do this, you don't do that, you often find that you're losing. And so in a sense, I do wonder if it all comes back to the central point here, which is if your starting position is not one of like, this is what I believe, this is my moral mission, these are my lines, and this is what I believe in. If that's not your guiding principle and everything falls in behind that, if your position actually is to defend something, a status quo, a kind of as many interests as possible, then you're fundamentally on the back foot to begin with. And so the failure in Gaza is then almost like illustrative of the wider point. It doesn't seem to be based in a moral purpose of British foreign policy.
Yeah, I would just add as an addendum, and we'll be out of time, but I think that authenticity counts for so much in the modern world, not just in politics. Anyone interested in leading a large organization, or being a decent person in their day-to-day life, or trying to communicate ideas, being authentic is a shortcut to people trusting you, people listening to you, and people engaging with you. It was like a central truth of human nature. And to me, it's no wonder that as political communication is professionalized, and the nature of standing up, pre-writing something, giving a speech, giving an interview, and it being so clear to everyone listening that you haven't listened to what you're being asked about, you've gone, this applies to preset response B, so that's the one I'll deliver. People can smell it a mile away. And it does connect to social media, but when you spend so much of your life watching other people talk, listening to other people talk, reading the words that other people have written, it's a central fact of modern life now. People are really good at detecting the register in which people communicate, and is this person communicating authentically with me? Is this person real? And if you can't do that, you are in really, really big trouble. And it's one of the central things when I talk about the sort of the old politics versus the new politics. I think it's so central. I think I may have said this to you when we were doing our 10 years of Brexit, talking about Mamdani, talking about Trump, talking about Farage, that these political communicators who really understand that fact. And I think Burnham has to understand it, because for me, it's one of the key places. I'm not just saying it's the comms, it's the comms, it's the comms. Clearly, listen to the podcast. We've talked about it in far deeper terms than that. But I think authenticity, if I go back to the question we started this with, when people like someone 30 years, what was Keir Starmer? The reason I pose that question is because I think it's really hard to answer what and who the authentic Keir Starmer is. And that's where we are.
Well, I think it may come back to this. He was one of the final attempts to keep alive the status quo that we'd been trying to keep alive probably since 2008. And despite the various crises that happen afterwards, I think you could take this story back even further, in a way that we've been living through a almost rolling period of major crises and foreign policy failures and domestic failures that have not really led to significant changes in our, in our central understanding, or our central kind of
constitutional settlement,
or settlement for the what the political class are trying to pursue.
Okay.
So let's say 2003 Iraq War. We've also got Libya and Syria. We've got the implosion of our economy in 2007-8. We have the rise of China happening at the same time. We have what do we have from that point? We have the implosion of the Eurozone. We have Brexit. We have all of these things, and then COVID. We have all of these things. Some of them crises that kind of blow in from outside, but which then show Britain is more vulnerable than almost any other comparable country. I know that the COVID response is, that is being still litigated. Were we hit harder than other countries or not? It looks to me like we've somehow ended up roughly in the middle on that. But, I think all of these things, there's incredibly significant moments which reveal a kind of more fundamental problem with the state. And I think this is where probably Andy Burnham's story is at its most significant. The argument that he's trying to make that these failures that define so much of Britain outside of the areas that are doing well. So outside of the southeast and pockets of success outside of that, bits of Manchester now, but the Cambridge, Edinburgh, say, these parts of the country that are doing well. Large swathes of this country is doing badly, just on bog standard average European terms. Just it's performing badly, and he's tracing that back to the 1980s. An interesting counter argument is being made by the right, which is tracing the story back to 1997, and everything is Tony Blair's fault, essentially. That everything was going fine. He comes in and he screws the country over with these constitutional reforms, which kind of stop the state from being able to do anything. That is their foundational, story of what has gone wrong. But you've now got two rival arguments starting to develop. One of kind of deindustrialized economic failure traced back to the 1980s, and the other a story of constitutional, liberal progressivism traced back to 1997. Both sides are basically saying that this is bad. The rot is real. The decline is real. You haven't really got a boosterish account on either side saying, "Yeah, come on, Britain's fundamentally great. All these people who are talking it down are wrong. We just need a bit of, release the animal spirits of the British, and we'll be back on track." They're both talking in really quite fundamental terms, and so I do wonder whether it comes to it that we'll be seeing, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer as the final prime ministers trying to protect the old way before something new comes along. But even that, I should probably add, just as an addendum on this, is maybe that is an ahistorical way of thinking, and maybe that people like you and I are too locked in to easy narratives. You have the Thatcherite narrative, the Blairite narrative, the Egerton analysis or whatever, and that actually most of history is just one of total chaos, in which you can't define. It's just a big bumpy road of madness, and maybe that's where we are.